Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Women Redefining podcast, where women throughout Alberta are talking about how they are redefining entrepreneurship. My name is Stephanie Baker-Hoff, and I am the podcast producer for this amazing series brought to you by the Women Entrepreneurship Knowledge Hub, or WEC for short. Your hosts for this podcast are Anita Kemp and Shannon Pestun. Anita is the program leader for WEC Alberta, based out of Mount Royal University, and Shannon Pestun is WEC's Senior Advisor for Business and Finance. WEC is part of the federal government's Women Entrepreneurship Strategy, investing $5 billion with the goal of doubling the number of women entrepreneurs in Canada by 2025. Led out of Ryerson University, there are 10 regional hubs across the country sharing research on and resources for women entrepreneurs in Canada. Drawing on the expertise of a network that includes more than 250 organizations, WEC also hosts and supports programming that highlights opportunities and best practices for women entrepreneurs and the organizations that support them. Through Women Redefining, we capture insightful and inspiring conversations to raise awareness throughout Alberta's entrepreneurship and innovation ecosystem, and raise the profiles of women entrepreneurs and their businesses so that we can continue to challenge the existing stereotypes of entrepreneurs and share firsthand how women are thinking, being, and doing entrepreneurship in Alberta. Before we dive into this episode, I invite you to take a moment to be fully present and recognize the many traditional lands on which we are connecting, and acknowledge with gratitude and respect the many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples whose footsteps were first to mark these lands.
Hello and welcome to the Women Redefining podcast. My name is Shannon Pestun and I'm the Senior Advisor, Business and Finance for the Women Entrepreneurship Knowledge Hub. Here with me today is Connie Stacey, owner of Growing Greener Innovations, a Canadian energy technology company that is focused on engineering and manufacturing batteries, battery management systems, and battery energy storage solutions for residential, commercial, and industrial customers. After founding Growing Greener Innovations in 2014 with a desire to create a better generator, today Connie's company has grown into one of Canada's top battery manufacturers and battery energy storage systems design companies. Welcome. I'm so excited to have this conversation with you, Connie. Great to see you.
Likewise, wonderful to be here.
The last time I saw you, you were competing at the Forum's Pitch for the Purse contest and pitch competition, and you walked away with a $50,000 prize. I know we're going to talk about that later, but what a great story coming out of Alberta on a national competition such as that.
Yeah, it was exciting.
Yes, you did a great job and represented Alberta women entrepreneurs so well. So Connie, super excited to have you. First of all, as we get going, tell me a little bit more about Growing Greener Innovations and what it is exactly that you do.
A lot of people have some confusion around the battery industry. So allow me to start by just giving a little bit of an explanation. There's kind of two main areas of batteries. One is the development of cells, which is, basically your fancy version of a AA battery, right? The individual cells. And then there's battery energy storage systems, or BESS. And those are the bigger systems that take those cells and then combine them with pretty advanced electronics to control electrical systems at a much larger scale typically. So we build battery energy storage systems. We don't build cells. So what we do is we really started kind of with that idea, like you mentioned, of trying to build a better portable solution, something to replace the rather unfortunate diesel engines. But we ended up expanding quite a bit past that once we really started to get going. So yeah, that's where we focus anyway.
Well, thanks. And let's go back to the story. I do happen to know a little bit about your entrepreneurial journey, and I love sort of the story that you talk about, walking through the neighborhood, you've got babies at this time, and, it was a loud generator that made you say, like, please don't wake up this kid. Like, here you are trying to, keep your baby asleep, going for a little walk. So I'm sure there's a lot more to that, but tell us a story about your entrepreneurial journey and from when the spark of the idea appeared to really where you're at today.
Well, you know what? You said it a lot more politely than I did that day. My twin boys were about 3 months old, and I was walking by, and they were asleep in a stroller, and the diesel generator was going. And I thought, if you wake these babies, I am going postal. Like, I mean, I was so sleep deprived; it was not a pretty day. But as I walked by, I kind of thought, well, why do we use those darn things? I mean, nobody really likes using a diesel generator. They're loud. They're very expensive. They're hard on the environment. There's not a lot of positives about them. So I thought, well, why can't we do something better for that? And I thought, well, what about a battery solution? Something where you're just storing energy and bringing it with you where you need it. It's silent. It's going to be much lower cost. It seemed to make sense. But when I started to kind of look into it, I talked to some of my friends that were in the trades, mostly construction. And I said, oh, I would love something that was silent. Just silent. That's all they really wanted. But you can't refill a battery like you can a gas can. So what am I going to do if it's 1 o'clock in the afternoon and my battery runs out? And I thought, well, okay, that's legit. So I kind of went back and I thought, well, how do we solve that problem? And I thought, well, what if you could just swap them in and out like Lego, or stack them up so that you could run however long you needed to run, and you just basically had more jerry cans, if you will, of battery, right? And I thought, well, that might be able to do it, but we have to be able to remove an electrician or an engineer from the scenario. And that's where it gets a lot more complicated, because batteries are used, in virtually everything these days. But when you're talking about variability, this person might need this much power, that person might need that much power. Usually there's an electrician or an engineer involved in those systems. So that's where the technology gets complicated. In terms of the process, when I realized that I could solve it with some kind of a battery system, and the tradespeople, when I went back to them, they were like, done. They didn't care what the cost was. They didn't care about weight. They didn't care about environment. All they wanted was silence. And I thought, okay, there's definitely a market here. But that wasn't what made me pull the trigger and decide to go for it. I was still pretty nervous. I'd always worked for other people. I'd always wanted to be an entrepreneur, but I didn't really have the guts to do it. I didn't have that push. And it was probably, oh gosh. So the original concept was around September of 2013. And then 2014, I incorporated and was just still doing research and kind of looking into battery chemistries and what was happening in the field. And then when I really started to research the bigger picture and global energy poverty, that's when it changed for me, because then it stopped being about just a portable energy solution to replace portable diesel engines. It became about solving a global problem that disproportionately affects women. And I thought, you know what? This is, like, for me, all of the things that I have volunteered with and worked on over the years have always been around supporting women, supporting equality for those who don't currently have it. And when I realized that what I was building, or what I wanted to build, could have a really enormous impact on that, that's when I pulled the trigger. That was the burn the ships moment. And I actually, thinking of the journey, I actually remember the night quite well. I was chatting with a friend of mine, another mom of twins. We were chatting, and I said, Jamie, maybe if you want to change the world, you have to win the game and make your own damn rules. And that was the night. And I just said, you know what, I'm going to go for this. And I was very fortunate that my wife is incredibly supportive, and she stood behind me, even knowing that she was going to be our family's income, because I wasn't going to make money for a long time. And she stood behind me to do that. And it was a crazy journey to get here.
Wow. So I just want to back up to, that sort of that aha moment. And, they come, and it's funny how our ideas do change. And when it connects into that passion, like, wow, that's the fuel right there. And I love how that came to you. But let's talk about your educational background. Like, how did this, what was your training? How did you come to this?
Most of my career, I worked in IT. I had about 20 years working as a programmer or project manager, mostly project management, honestly. Before that, I had a diploma in programming, and previous to that, I'd had a Bachelor of Arts. My Bachelor of Arts was actually in sport administration, so completely unrelated. Totally different. But actually, surprisingly, the skills I learned in that became very effective in planning out the power system, because I think sometimes in innovation, people struggle because they keep looking at something from the same perspective. But one of the things that I learned to do when I was planning big sporting events was I had this process I would go through and I'd list all my stakeholders. Well, I've got the athletes, I've got the referees, I've got the parents, I've got, concession people, and I would make a list. And then I would mentally walk through the event in each person's shoes. What do they need? What are they missing, etc. So I had this whole process I would do. And when I started to build the system, that's how I approached the design. Like I had a technical background. In fact, it worked much, much longer than I ever did doing sports. But that was kind of how I approached it. I said, okay, if I'm a single mom, sub-Saharan Africa in a rural village, what does it look like for me? If I'm the CEO of a big company in the middle of North America that's well grid supplied, etc. What does it look like for me? And I walked through as many scenarios as I could to find out what was the common things between each of the different people and different groups. And the interesting thing was when I kind of went through as many different things as I could think of, there were really only three things that were common to absolutely everybody. The first was whatever we built had to truly be plug and play, and a lot of people say, oh, it's plug and play. You just need an electrician to come over and do this. Okay, so that's actually not plug and play by definition. So had to be plug and play, because if you're that rural sub-Saharan African single mom, your next door neighbor is not an electrician or an engineer. And it's just not going to work. So that was probably the biggest single component. Then it also had to be portable, because no matter what we do these days, that is our life. In every society, portability has become a mandate. It's a requirement.
Yes.
And the third was that it had to be scalable, because our power needs are always going up. And it's not unlike it was and still is for computers that, you get a new processor, a new phone, and then the software becomes bigger, and then you need a bigger processor again. Well, the same thing happens with electricity. Get more energy, and then you need more energy. So if we get someone to an energy tier 1, where maybe they have light in their home for a certain number of hours a day, well, now their lives are going to improve, and maybe they can go to school and read at night. Well, maybe now they're going to have a computer, or they're going to have something they want to be able to cook with. Well, now they're going to need more energy. In fact, studies have shown that access to energy is perfectly correlated to economic growth. So you literally can't alleviate poverty without alleviating energy poverty. That was kind of one of my biggest motivators.
Well, I love that. And your mission is certainly a big one. And let's talk about your mission, because your mission is to empower people and eliminate energy poverty for good. Let's talk about what is energy poverty.
Well, it's funny, in Canada, Alberta in particular, I think it's hard for us to really picture what the global energy situation looks like, because we're so energy rich, and not just oil and gas. I mean, we have one of the most redundant, strong electrical grids in the world in Canada. We're very fortunate. So we have this idea that the problem is small. It's not. I'll give you three numbers that are going to blow your mind. One, there are over 1 billion people in the world that have zero access to electricity, which means they see by candlelight. That's all they've got for light. That's basically 1/8 of the world's population. Then when you go to not enough energy to cook in any other way than to burn some kind of biomass, which is horrible on the environment and horrible on health, you're talking about 2.6 billion people. That's 1/3 of the world. Don't even have enough to cook in any way other than over some kind of open flame, which is great if you're camping and it's by choice, but that's not the circumstance for these people. And then when you get to what's called domestic energy poverty, which is essentially where maybe you only have low voltage power, or you might only have power certain hours of the day, or there's just such rampant blackouts that it's unreliable. That's over half the world's population. I mean, that's mind-blowing to me. It's huge.
Wow. And, you talked earlier about something being scalable, and energy. It is a global need. And so really looking forward to where you're taking the company, because I know that you've been growing. I know that you've, been winning pitch competitions, and we're going to talk about that in a little bit. But you're not a stranger to them, right? So I know that you've done Dragon's Den, you did Pitch for the Purse, you've been in international pitch competitions. Let's talk about the importance of pitch competitions and how they've shaped you as an entrepreneur, and maybe even changed the trajectory of your business.
Yeah, you know what? I don't like them. I'm not bad at them, but I don't like doing them. They're nerve-wracking, I won't lie. Even when it's a small audience, and I've had them at every size and range. I think probably some of my smaller ones were like 30, 40 people that I pitched in front of, and the bigger ones were like 2,000 people.
Wow.
In fact, the 2,000 person one was down in Tampa, and there were 3 big theater-sized screens behind me. The middle one had me, which was really intimidating, and then the other 2 had my slides and the things I was playing, and it was massive, right? So it's nerve-wracking, but it's important, but not necessarily for the reason people think. The Dragon's Den, et cetera, that kind of, or Shark's Tank, those kind of programs make people think, you're going to walk away with a big check. That's not really how it works. Sometimes there's a prize that is, here you go, like with the forum. I mean, that was huge, a $50,000 check. That was fabulous. I was definitely excited. But people think often, like say with the Dragon's Den or doing another type of pitch, that someone's going to hand you a check at the end of the conversation. But when you really sit down and think about it, that that's not going to be the case. Nobody's handing you a multi-million-dollar check after listening to you talk for 10 minutes. I mean, I'm a pretty good talker, I think, like a newfie background, but nobody is giving you, $10 million after 10 minutes of talking. So I think that people have a misconception about what it is. A pitch really is about opening a door or starting a conversation. And when you take it from that perspective, it's a lot easier to understand what you need to put in your pitch. You have to put your pitch not focused on what is the most important parts of your business, but what's the most important part for your audience? Because the audience really varies. I've had ones where it was technical conferences, building smarter cities, smart cities initiatives. Well, I talked much more tech because they were an audience that was tech savvy. When I did the forum, it was a pretty short time, and it was a business audience, but not necessarily a technical audience. And the one in Tampa was an incredibly broad audience. And it was actually a supplier diversity event for the LGBTI community. And so there were CEOs and corporations from Fortune 500, but there were also tiny, tiny little suppliers too. So it was really mixed. So different, depending on which audience I was pitching to, I realized I had to talk to the audience. Now, there's always more. I could talk about my business for a lot longer than 10 minutes, let me tell you. Much less 3 minutes when, the pitches are shorter, or 5 minutes. So you really have to pick what's going to resonate with the audience, because it's about creating a conversation that you're going to follow up later. And it was very, very successful for us in that regard, because it becomes a marketing tool. It's an opportunity to, here's a little taste of what we do. If you want to know more, come talk to me. And it took a while to get used to them and get better at them, but it became very successful. That one in Tampa, and before I got off the stage, I had on the conference app messages from T-Mobile and GM, General Motors, and several more. And these were big names, and they're people that are hard to get in front of. So when you have the opportunity to pitch, you get to be in front of a lot of people that maybe otherwise it would be tough to get in front of. So I mean, it's a wonderful tool, but you need to be prepared, I think, for what the reality is.
Yeah, that's really great advice. And I had the pleasure of being on the community panel for the forum and watched your journey of the pitch competition, even watched the evolution of your pitch. And I'll remind you too, at that conference, I think there was 2,000 live. We obviously were in a time of COVID, so it was a virtual event, and there were 2,000 people voting for you. And what a boost for the business. And again, talking about awareness, but also talking about that vote of confidence coming from a very wide array of people.
Yeah.
You talked earlier about your wife and the support that she gave you. So who has inspired you? Maybe it is your wife, but who has inspired you or supported you the most throughout this entrepreneurial journey? And what did that look like?
Well, for me, I think a lot of the why is my kids. I mean, my kids are my everything. I adore my family as much as having 3 children, 8 and under is an exhausting experience. It is absolutely the best part of my life. So when I think about making the world a better place or trying to help in that path, I think about them. In terms of who supported me, though, as much as my son Oliver would really like to help me engineer the next battery system, he's told me all sorts of details he'd like to have on it. So we'll see how that one rolls out. But in terms of more practical support, my wife has been a big part of that. I mean, honestly, she's been my rock. We couldn't afford for me to have gone down this journey without her committing to being the breadwinner, because I've gone without a salary a long time. And it was only with the promise of we'll get there eventually. And at the start, let me tell you, it did not look good, because a lot of people wanted to see or were too accepting of a openly gay woman making batteries. Let's say it was a bit of a rare unicorn in that space. The other people that were really really supportive for me were my best friend, Lana, who I've known since I was 14. So she and I have just stuck by each other all the way through. And she's just been my biggest supporter in terms of, you know what, you can do this. I'm behind you. I have faith in you. And she doesn't understand the technology overly. She's never really had that interest. She just knows that what the vision is, what I'm trying to accomplish, and she knows me. So whenever I feel down, she's my gal who, is right behind me, supporting me. And we actually got to a point where we said, you know what, we're going to have a weekly date, a BFF night. And in fact, it's tonight. And we get together and we talk about things going on in our life and just support each other. So she was really huge. The other one that I think really stands out for me was my mom, and in two ways. One, I mean, she just believes in me. I mean, she's my mom. But the other was she's actually, I'd say, the hardest worker I've ever met in my entire life. And I've met now thousands of people. But where we came from in Newfoundland, we were rural. She grew up, there was no road. She didn't see pavement until she was 13 years old.
Oh, wow.
So she didn't have electricity, she didn't have running water, outdoor plumbing, you name it. And my dad was the same. You could only get to their communities by boat. So yeah, imagine being pregnant and having a 3-hour boat ride to get to the nearest cottage hospitals. Yeah, that's how they grew up. It made both of my parents into incredibly hard workers because every day started with chop wood for the wood burning fireplace, get water from the well, all of the different things that just keep you up and running that we don't do. And that was the 60s, and into even the 70s. They didn't build a road to North Harbor, where I'm from, until 67. So, 7 years before I was born. So not by a lot. So I watch her, and I mean, her work ethic is actually just ridiculous. I mean, she can't rest. I mean, it's a family joke. She'll sit down and we're like, God's sakes, Melva, put down the knitting needles, put down the broom, but just stop. Because she can't. If there's work to be done, and there's always work to be done, she's going. And so for me, watching her and having had that example in my life, I know what it means to work. And I know how much more work is placed upon women often than men. Because as much as my dad's a great guy, don't get me wrong, the expectations were, they both worked full time, but most of the housework and things at home fell to my mom. Eventually my mom set him straight and he's much better about housework now. But those were the things that, a lot of us grew up with and still have today, is that the women in the household are often basically working 2 full-time jobs because you've got everything that has to be happening at home and everything that happens in your workplace. So yeah, those were kind of the 3 people that have had the biggest impact. And yes, you might note they are all women.
Well, they are all women. And you know what I also love too is that it's the more vulnerable side of you, right? These are the people that really know you when you're at your high, when you're at your low, when they need to push you. And, I often so grateful, like you have got a mom that's been my biggest cheerleader, but I'm always scared to go to her for advice because she's always thinks everything I do is great. And I have a feeling that, your mom is probably similar. She's probably just so proud of everything that you're doing. So let's talk about balance. I mean, you do mention like having, running a, I don't really say it's a startup anymore. I mean, you're 7 years into the company, but I mean, you're still in those growing stages. Let's talk about balancing family, which is also really important to you. A growing company that is international. Like, how do you find time to balance and take care of yourself?
It's been a challenge. And there's definitely been areas where I knew I took a hit. And those are things I'm working on now. So one of the big things for me, and something I did early on, was I very easily identified certain things that just didn't hit the priority list. And one of them was watching TV or going to the movies. I mean, I might go to a movie once a year, and pretty much only if it's Star Wars related. I'm putting my geek out there. But otherwise, I mean, I spend very, very little time in front of a TV. If I've got any spare time I want to read, I don't really want to spend it on TV. And that's a big one. People don't think that it takes up that much time but when you add it up, very frequently people are an hour plus a day and more on the Saturday and Sunday. 10, 15 hours extra that I can put somewhere else in my life. So that was one thing that helped me balance right off, because I just said, you know what, really doesn't do anything for me. It's super low priority. It's gone. I do still do some things because, after all, I want things where I can release and just relax and have a laugh. The other thing that I think really was the opposite was I let my health get a lot worse over those 7 years. I know that I took a lot of hits in terms of just hey, I have a desk job. You know what? When you're engineering battery systems, a lot of it's spent in front of a computer. And COVID only made that worse because you couldn't go out anywhere.
Mhm.
But in this past year, as we really started kind of the next, as we said, internally growing greener 2.0, as we're moving to kind of that next stage in our evolution, we brought on more senior executive. And in our strategic planning, I put and was very supported by our executive team that my health was one of the strategic initiatives. And so I have backed off. I book at least an hour in my day every single day to focus on health related things. So usually it's go for a walk or do something like that, but it's making the time to make it happen. And, getting that support internally and externally is making a huge difference. So balance is always something that's hard to find, but it's, you just, when you see something that's starting to fall behind you, evaluate, figure out how you can balance it again and shift.
Well, I think entrepreneurs, this is always the big challenge, right? Is that, you're wearing multiple hats, Connie from HR has to talk to Connie from finance and Connie from marketing and Connie from pitching. Like you wear all these multiple hats and you're balancing time, and time is such a precious currency. And so, I applaud you for recognizing those areas where you're trying to see that something's not working and doing something about it. How great to have the support of the team behind you, because really you are the center, you are the visionary, and your health is very important in all facets. You mentioned earlier, and it's come through a couple of times, that you've supported, women all throughout your career. Your strong role models are women. I want to ask you a question. Like with the Women Entrepreneurship Knowledge Hub, we really focus on the importance of overcoming stereotypes and the importance of creating a more diverse and inclusive economy. From your perspective, how important is it that we challenge some of these existing stereotypes of women entrepreneurs and their businesses?
I think it's the number one priority, and not just the stereotypes of women in entrepreneurship roles, but stereotypes about women. One of the single hardest things that I face, I face a double challenge in being both a woman and being openly gay. And I have faced discrimination for both, very obvious discrimination, and sometimes lots of just unconscious bias. But part of it comes in what we expect or think a woman is, or what a woman should look like. I tend to dress much more unisex. That's probably the easiest way to put it. I'm a jeans and t-shirts kind of gal most of the time if I'm not in a business meeting, and the same jeans and t-shirt can be on a man or a woman. But that makes me not very typical in terms of my looks. I don't wear makeup and I have short hair. So when I travel abroad, I'm not always comfortable in things like using public bathrooms. I've been to places where, I was at the Canada India Tech Summit a few years ago on a panel as a guest of the government of Canada at a 5-star hotel, got chased out of the bathroom by the staff. Yeah, and that's hard. That later in that trip, when I got to Indonesia, I simply couldn't use public bathrooms because I didn't think I could safely. I felt threatened physically by the way people looked at me and kind of acted around me. So I really have to be aware of that. And it comes not, honestly, sure, stereotypes, somebody's going to look at me and say, oh yeah, she's gay. Oh, okay, I do kind of fit the stereotype a bit. But, the truth is mostly they're looking and thinking, she doesn't look the way I expect a woman to look. A woman's supposed to wear makeup. A woman's supposed to do her hair this way. A woman's supposed to dress a certain way. My wife, also openly gay, much more traditional feminine in her style. So she doesn't face the same things. And that really comes down not to being gay, but how we expect women to behave and look. And it gets complicated because now, when you step into roles that are traditionally held by men and you're coming in and clearly emphasizing that you're a woman, how does that affect how they treat you versus coming in and not looking traditionally what they expect a woman to look like, and how do they treat you? And it's really interesting. The responses I've had over, the 7 years have been they've been so broad. There's been the extreme, like I've worried about violence. I have recently received a handwritten letter. You don't get those every day, urging me away from my sinful life and to return to the ways of God. And, I still get those things. We think it doesn't happen anymore, but it's still there. But then there's the other extreme. There's the little subtle things from people who do mean to be supportive, but don't recognize how little behaviors can make things more difficult or give an incorrect impression. And I'm going to use an example. I was in a just kind of an ecosystem meeting in the Edmonton area, and I was talking with 3 other people, all gentlemen, all actually white Caucasian males, middle-aged. And one was another entrepreneur, and two were kind of support like organizations. And all three of them were people that I like and who support me. But during the conversation, it went something like this. The four of us are speaking, and they said to the other entrepreneur, "How's this going?" Responds very tech. The tech supporters are talking tech back. And then one of them turns to me and goes, "Now, Missy, have you signed up for XYZ?" And if anybody else was listening to our conversation, I was just made to look like the most junior person in that room or in that conversation. In fact, I had the most tech experience of all four of us, but I was made to look inadvertently to be junior. And it's a tough one because what do you do? Like, these are people I like, who I trust, who support me, but they don't recognize that, "Oh, it's so good to see you here." It's not appropriate. I don't come up to male colleagues in the field and go, "Oh, hey, honey." I mean, it's just not appropriate, but they don't recognize it because there's subtle things, and they are supportive. Now, those things often can be the biggest impact in an everyday scenario. Because in Canada, we're very lucky that, outright sexism is not that common. And I'm thankful for that. Still happens, but
Yes.
it's less frequent. But the bias, that's a different story entirely.
Well, you bring up bias, and I even think we would look to the tech and the VC environment, and you and I have spoken about this as well in the past. But to the Connies study that looks at that the fact that women get asked different questions than males in a pitching environment. We've seen studies that were, I think this one was done out of Harvard, that looked at a business plan, the same business plan, but read by a male voice and read by a female voice. And the plan that was read by the male voice had a higher propensity to acquire the funding. That there's something wrong with the system to say, like, their unconscious bias does, and actually implicit in bias exists as well. And I think it's so important. I do believe the more we see, the more we feel that we can be as well. And myself, I'm Indigenous, and I certainly can see that in our Indigenous communities as well. The importance of role models and being able to shatter some of these stereotypes are so critically important for people to be proud of and to know where they come from. And I think that that's a huge part of it. And I also think that it's this diverse, inclusive entrepreneurial system that is going to change what we know as capitalism today. And so I do think that there's so much good in this purpose-driven economy. And I love the mission that you have for your company. I love how global it is in scope. I love how it's hoping to change the world and reduce our energy poverty. These are the conversations now that we're starting to see coming out of women-led companies like yours. So if I fast forward to your hope for the future of women's entrepreneurship, I sort of shared a little bit of mine there, but what changes do you believe will have the biggest impact on closing the gender gap, and why?
Well, one of them for sure is something you just hit on, and it's the role models part. Seeing women in those chairs that are currently occupied almost entirely by men. And that's not to give men a hard time. It's not their fault that they're there, but we do have biases that are tough to overcome. And I was actually in an accelerator not that long ago and talked with a few different ones who said, there's often that tendency to look at a person pitching and say, "I see myself in them." Well, if historically the people in that room are older white men, then they will see themselves in younger white men, which means persons of color, Indigenous, LGBTI, and women are really at a disadvantage. And that changes dramatically when you get more women into those roles. Now, currently, there's still certainly studies that suggest that women are harder on women, in fact, but I think that that's something that changes with volume. And one of the things that I always do is, no matter what the podcast, the interview, no matter what the scenario, I always out myself. And believe me, that's not always a fun thing to do, but I think it's an incredibly important thing to do because there are other people that are LGBTI that are following, and they need to know that there are role models. Just like you were saying within the Indigenous community, you need to know there are role models. And being visible then becomes part of almost an imperative, for those people who are kind of more out in front to say, you know what, maybe I'm going to take a few hits. Maybe I'm going to get some random handwritten letter. But you know what? That's okay. I went through lots of rough times in my years in terms of discrimination that was a lot more violent and verbally abusive when I was younger. But that also makes me tougher now. And people say stuff and I'm like, yeah, what, you think I haven't heard it before? So I feel almost obligated to stand out in front because I have taken it. I have gotten through it. And if I can make it even an ounce easier for the women that come after me, then I'm going to do it. So I think honestly, that role model piece is one of the biggest things. The other thing that I think, and I have experienced that's had an enormous impact, has been supplier diversity programs. And I'm not sure how familiar everybody would be with them, but often they're misrepresented. People think it's a handout. It's not. What it is a ticket to the dance. And I'm proudly a certified female-owned business as well as a certified LGBTI business. And what that means is effectively, I get an opportunity to be in front of or meet with buyers that would be very difficult for me otherwise to meet with because I don't have the network. And there lies part of the problem. We get a lot of our connections through our extended network. So I know so-and-so and he knows so-and-so. But when you come from a diverse background and you don't have that network, it becomes infinitely more difficult. I mean, again, how many Indigenous, I think, has particularly had some hardship in this area, but who do you look to? Who do you find in your role models that you can go to and what are their network? It's small, and that puts you at a significant disadvantage. So the supplier diversity programs basically give you an opportunity to be in front of buyers that would otherwise be difficult to meet. You still have to have the best business, you still have to have the best product, the best service, all of those things are still the same, but it's an introduction. It's a ticket to the dance. And that to me is a great way to help people kind of make that step. And I'll actually use an example here. When I'd say there was two things that really changed gears for us. Because at the start, we had no support. Everybody was like, you gotta be kidding me. This woman thinks she's gonna make batteries. She's cuckoo. Cocoa Puffs or whatever it was. It was after two things happened. One, we applied, it was just kind of an online thing. We applied to a U.S. Department of Defense Innovation Award. So there was no association of, was this application from a woman or man? They really didn't know unless they went out of their way to look. They just had a company name and the innovation. Well, we won. Well, all of a sudden, people went, oh, U.S. Department of Defense? Like, they know their tech. Maybe there's something here after all. Now, we got that, and partly because I think we didn't have to face that bias. The other part was because of the supplier diversity, we got an opportunity to get in front of some big corporate 500s. And that included groups like EY. Well, we sold to EY. It was only a small purchase order. It wasn't gigantuan. But when you get to list on your website that your customers include Ernst & Young, or the City of Edmonton, or the Government of Canada. Now it's the Department of Defense for Canada. Like, those are big names, and all of a sudden it adds to your legitimacy. So even though those initial contracts might have been quite small, they helped us establish and give people the sense that, yeah, this is a company, if these big companies are willing to work with them, then they got to have something there. And it helped kind of get us established. And I think those two things in particular, role models and supplier diversity programs, can be incredibly, incredibly powerful.
Well, I couldn't agree with you more. And we take a look at, some of the changing faces of purchasing departments. We are seeing so much more supplier diversity. And so I couldn't agree more. Great advice there. I know we're coming up to time, and I want to be able to just close our conversation with asking you, when you take a look to the future, what does success look like for you, Connie Stacey, as well as for the business?
Well, we haven't kind of released all of our technology plans. So I will say this in kind of a high level, but the system itself is really meant, the whole design behind it and all of the things that will be coming down the road was made such that, or designed such that ideally any person should be able to lead a clean, sustainable life without the need to rely on a large utility or government, etc. Everybody should be able to be independent and still lead a clean, healthy life. So for me, being able to get to that point where those products are in place where someone can choose or choose not to be attached to the grid or however they want to be, they have more option. So for me, part of it is getting the technology out. I mean, there's always the numbers, and I think that we're going to do okay. Things have been going well and picking up rather rapidly. So the money will be there, but the money was never the number one driver for me. I mean, everybody who gets into entrepreneurship wants to do well. I'm not going to lie. I'd really, really rather not fly economy if I don't have to. But for me, it's much more than just the money part. I'd really like to get the technology built around this whole system because it really is a system. We talk about it as a power system. And I'd like to see that accomplished. And we're well on our way. In terms of me personally, It's been a really interesting, evolving journey. People ask me so often, everybody gets this, what's your exit strategy? What's your exit strategy? I'm like, dude, I'm still working on an entry strategy. Can we slow down on the exit? And but then, of course, you don't know what you're talking about if you don't have an exit strategy. And I'm like, look, I'm not building something short term. I'm not trying to build something just to a really small level to sell off to somebody else to do something else. That's very common, that serial entrepreneur sort of path among men, but is way less common among women. Women really like to build. They like to nurture and grow things. It's something that we're socialized to do. So it's more common. So for me, I'm growing this, and I would like, I think, the opportunity to grow a few of my other ideas that I have on in my little black book of drawings and designs and stuff. So there are some other things, like I have a couple different things that I think will be patentable that might turn into other companies. So I could certainly see expanding and having other divisions, or even splitting them out entirely, depending on how things roll out. So for me, I want to keep doing that inventing and building the cool new tech part. For me, that's where the best excitement is. That and talking to people, obviously. Can't be a newfie without that part. And for the business, I think if we can really build out the technology here and just keep working towards that full power system, I think that would be incredible. And I think it will be extremely profitable as well.
Well, Connie, what a story. So many words of wisdom in here. I can't thank you enough for sharing just your inspirational story, but your vulnerability and your openness to truly share what this journey has been for you. And I certainly know that I'm looking forward to following what you accomplish in the future. You've got a huge fan in me and over at the Women Entrepreneurship Knowledge Hub. And so thank you for taking the time to share your story and being a role model for others. I am so grateful for all that you're doing. And I love that not only are you sort of the serial entrepreneur mentality, but you're also the legacy entrepreneur. And you don't, I mean, we do see that combination in women, but we don't talk about the power of that serial mentality in a more sustainable legacy type business. So thank you. And to all of our listeners, thank you for joining in today and taking the time to hear about Connie's story. We invite you as well to listen to the full series of conversations in our Women Redefining podcast, a podcast that's focusing on Alberta women entrepreneurs. And I also invite you to check out the wekh.ca website, that stands for wek.ca, for our See It, Be It database, where you're going to discover over 1,000 successful women entrepreneurs across Canada who are changing our world with their ideas, their innovations, and their passions. Connie, thank you so much for joining me today, and I look forward to staying connected with you well into the future.